Welcome back to another episode. Now, a while back, I read this very interesting book. It's a book that actually comes in multiple volumes. It's not just one book. It's a lot of books all together, but they're all very interesting. It's a book that I still haven't finished. It's called The Complete History of Civilization, and it's really the reason why I talk so much about the ancient world. I'm just fascinated by that. But the real reason why I find it so interesting is that it happened such a long time ago. Just imagine that, thousands of years difference. It was a totally different reality for those people. They lived in a totally different world. Now, of course, there were many civilizations and people of interest of the time, right? We talked about the ancient Greeks, we talked a little bit about the Romans, and we also talked about the Egyptians. But we've never talked about Babylon, the infamous city that the Bible can't seem to stop referring to. If you look at the Bible, there are a lot of references to Babylon. It just makes you wonder, what was Babylon? What was its history? Well, that's the topic of this week's episode. Welcome to Vlogs and Knowledge. Babylon, for those who don't know, was a very important city in the ancient world. It was a big center of culture, art, and innovation. But like most civilizations that come from that time, Babylon likes to keep its secrets for himself. If it's not the many conquests and invasions, or the repeated destruction of the city, or even just the physical changes to the environment itself, then it's simply our lack of knowledge on the matter. We just don't know the whole story. Sure, we have an idea, but that idea is based on the archaeological findings that we have, and even those, we're just beginning to start to find them. The story is just being built right now. We are literally putting the pieces of the puzzle together right now, and because we're doing that, there's no way that we can know for sure what happened, right? All we can do is guess. Which is why you should take everything that I say in this video with a grain of salt. Everything that I'm teaching you is based on what historians or archaeologists are able to tell with the limited knowledge that they have. For all we know, there could be a whole different side to the story that we have no idea about, and really, there's no way that we can know. But even then, this story is still interesting. But as always, let's put all this in historical context and get some background. The city of Babylon has a very long story. It started around the year 2300 BC and lasted all the way up to the Roman Empire. Now that's a lot of history. But luckily for us, for a lot of that time, Babylon was under invasion by other people. And because of that, Babylon really wasn't Babylon. It was taken over. It didn't get a chance to flourish. And because of that, we only get two periods of about a few hundred years each where Babylon can really shine and become its own independent city. The city was built on a big river in Mesopotamia, but today that area is called Iraq. Most of the cities from that time were built on rivers because that was the easiest way that you could grow crops. In fact, it was the only way. Iraq, Afghanistan, and all of that is a desert. The only way to get water is to be by the river. And plus, if every city is on the river, well, it makes it easier to travel between cities. Now, we assume that Babylon was started as some sort of port or small settlement that was in use to help bigger civilizations. But again, this is a guess. We have no real records of what happened. We don't really know why Babylon was created. Now, a few hundred years after that, we have the real history of Babylon, at least the first part of it. Now, I don't usually name names, but in this case I have to, because here we literally have one man making the entire difference. His name was Hammurabi, and he was the most famous king of Babylon, and for good reason too. He started something that was way too early for his time. Hammurabi took what was a small, minuscule, insignificant port along the river and made it into the biggest power in Mesopotamia. Babylon at its height, when Hammurabi was in power, it was insane. It was the biggest city there was. He went even as far as uniting the different city-states in Mesopotamia and calling that whole area Babylonia. Unfortunately, that didn't last too long. Well, the details about Hammurabi, how he took Babylon, made it such a big city, and then eventually lost it after his death are for you to research, I have to talk about the Code of Hammurabi. This code, or should I say this set of laws, was really the first time that we had rules that were enforceable in court if broken. If we're really being honest, this was kind of the first set of laws ever written. We discovered the Code of Hammurabi about 100 years ago on a set of clay tablets, and the reason why it was on clay tablets is because at the time that's where they used to write. They hadn't discovered paper yet. The code itself consists of about 282 laws that each have their own punishments that are enforceable in court. This was the very first example of a legal system. It's the first example that we have and that we discovered. And we only discovered it 100 years ago. That's very recent. Now just think about it for a second. We're all used to hear about the law of Moses, right? The 10 Commandments, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. Well, those were written about the year 500 BC, maybe even a little later. We don't know for sure. The Code of Hammurabi, on the other hand, was written around the year 1700 BC. Now that's more than 1,000 years after Moses. And plus, Hammurabi has 270 more laws than Moses did. Now, I'm not saying that Moses wasn't impressive. The 10 Commandments are really impressive, but this was equally as impressive, but perhaps in a different way. It was impressive because it was just so early. Unfortunately, like by that point, there was only like two big civilizations at the time, and really them didn't really have that good of a code as Hammurabi did. His was really the first code of laws, and it's perhaps the reason why Babylon would soon come to dominate the whole of Mesopotamia. As great of a leader as Hammurabi was, he, like all humans, eventually died, and with his death comes the end of the first period of Babylon. After his death, Babylon was quickly invaded by barbarians and other tribes, and really got to have like 1,000 years of just pure darkness and conquest. Like, Babylon was not able to shine for 1,000 years because it kept getting conquered by different people. In those 1,000 years, we have many revolts, many invasions. The city was destroyed multiple times and then rebuilt multiple times, only to be destroyed again multiple times. Now, of course, when your city keeps getting invaded, then destroyed, then rebuilt, then destroyed, and so on, it's kind of hard to be the dominating power in Mesopotamia, right? Like, you have to deal with your own battles before you can conquer the entire world. After many revolts, around the year 700 BC, things kind of calmed down. The city went to a different king, and this time it stuck. The city was rebuilt, and this time in a much bigger size. Like the king, he really wanted the city to be big. He invested a lot of money, built a lot of temples, a lot of amenities, and this is what we call the Neo-Babylonian period. Now, of course, by this time, the rest of the ancient world was evolving as well. Like, numerous cities and civilizations all appeared, because really we're talking about 1,000 years between the different Babylonian periods. The Egyptians had already built their pyramids, and the ancient Greeks were about to build their temples and their statues, but Babylon too had some things up her sleeve. For one, this was when the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built. Like, this remarkable feat of engineering that mixed brick with nature was something that had never been seen before. There were flowers, palm trees, rivers, bricks, all mixed in together so beautifully that the people were just amazed. Like, living in Babylon at that time was something to be proud of. A famous historian from that era classified them as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, along with the pyramids and the Greek temples. However, I have to tell you that we have no archaeological evidence of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. As far as we know, they may have never existed. Like, it may have been just a pure legend. We don't know. Like, the site of Babylon doesn't have any hanging gardens. We have no idea what was going on. Babylon is also the city where supposedly the Tower of Babel was being built. You know, in the Bible, there's this story about how people wanted to reach God, so they built a tower to reach him, but then God didn't want that, so he made them all speak different languages to kind of confuse them and stop the building of the tower. Well, apparently that happened in Babylon, but again, we have no real records of this. It is believed that Babylon was the biggest city in the entire world in both of those periods. Like, it was the only city, in the ancient world at least, that managed to reach almost 200,000 people. It was heavy in arts, culture, and even mathematics. Like, I know I said that the Greeks were really the ones who popularized mathematics, but even the Greeks had to have learned from somewhere, right? Babylon is also the place where the Jews were exiled from Egypt. Like, that's why we have a lot of stories about Babylon in the Bible. Like, we know the Jews have a very lengthy history, and a lot of that history is spent in Babylon. But it wasn't only the Jews. Like, you had many other tribes and people from around Mesopotamia all come to Babylon, especially in those 2 periods when Babylon was the greatest city. Like, you wanted to go to Babylon because, I mean, what other city would have 200,000 people in the ancient world? Like, no other city. Like, if you wanted some action, you were going to go to Babylon. The city was really known for its bricks and having developed a lot of technology with bricks. Like, people would come from around Mesopotamia just to get some of those bricks. Like, Babylon's bricks were really something. Like, apparently, I don't know what. I mean, it's a brick, right? Like, what else can you expect from a brick? But people wanted Babylonian bricks. Unfortunately, even this second period didn't really last all that long. Eventually, in the year 500 BC, it was invaded by the Persians, and then the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. And during those invasions, Babylon really didn't get a chance to prosper. Like, it's hard to prosper when there's war, when there's people occupying your city, some people destroying it, some people making it great. Like, it's kind of hard to be independent. It's actually very similar to what happened to the Egyptians. Like, them too at some point were prosperous, were influential, and really dominated their area. But as time went on, they eventually were invaded by the Persians, then by the Greeks, and eventually also by the Romans. And after the Romans, Egypt was really not what it once was. It's something that unfortunately is inevitable with the course of history, right? Like, we're always gonna have wars, we're always gonna have people fighting people, and we're always gonna have people taking over cities. Like, it's inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. All we can do is try to look, try to dig, try to find new stuff and make sense of what happened, right? Like, we have a big puzzle in front of us waiting to be put together. And speaking of putting the pieces together, really putting the puzzle together, I just want to touch on what we know about Babylon today. Like, what is the archaeological state of Babylon today? Because as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we're only starting to learn about it. Like, this is all very new. The very first excavations of Babylon happened around the turn of the 20th century. That's like 100 years ago. We discovered the Code of Hammurabi, but we don't have much more. Like, there's still a lot to learn. And unfortunately, we are dealing with like thousands of years of history. A lot of things can happen in thousands of years. Like, the environment changes, rivers can change, mountains can form, and like a lot of things can destroy things. In fact, the river that was once passing through Babylon has now inundated half the city, which means that we have no way to access half of the city. We have no way to dig up any archaeological findings because the river just made everything inaccessible. The only thing we do know, and the only real place that we can look, is to look at neighboring cities and see what they were saying about Babylon if those cities weren't destroyed by the test of time, because a lot of these cities were. We're very limited as to what we can use for information. All in all, we're still students about Babylon, we're still learning, and I find this very interesting because we live in a time where something could happen. A news story could pop up about Babylon that we haven't heard of before, and that's interesting. But even with everything that we know now, Babylon was a huge city. It was a center of culture, it was a center of mathematics and art. It was very influential for its time, and it also managed to dominate a lot of Mesopotamia in the very short history that it had. Babylon has given us a lot, but not just to us, also to other civilizations who took whatever they wanted from them and improved it with their own. That's the course of history. People learn things from other civilizations and they develop their own style of doing things, and then it just keeps going on. So that kind of covers the history of Babylon. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave it a big thumbs up, share it to a friend, and also do subscribe because it really does help me out a lot. It shows me that you enjoy my content. And now it's time for questions. Have you heard about Babylon before? Do you believe the hanging gardens of Babylon existed? And are you impressed with the quote of Hammurabi, especially given the fact that it was so early? Please do leave me a comment. I would love to read and answer them all. And bonus points for you. If you do, you might be featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. As you know, and as I say at the end of every video, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay. I'm actually doing this on purpose because I want you guys to go out and research on your own and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Cosden. You can follow me on social media. The links will be in the description. And also make sure to check out my second channel where you get to see behind the scenes of everything that I do on this channel. Link is also in the description. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.